Hello again, everybody, and welcome back for another video. For this one, I want to talk about the essay I gave you to read it for last week, Should Writers Use Their Own English by Vershawn Young. This is an essay that I always do at the beginning of every semester with the classes that I teach. I personally tend to agree with this essay. We'll talk about the argument that it makes. I'll go through the questions that I asked you. I read through your discussion posts as well, so I'll reference some of those. But I just want to say generally that I think students, if nothing else, find this essay interesting or engaging. I usually do this in the first day of class, and I'll like hand it out to everybody and have people read it and stuff. This essay is from a journal. If you guys know, if you guys have done any research, like for college, you might have seen like a journal. Journals are where academics and professors get their essays published. So it's kind of like the highest level of academic writing. Journals or books, are like what professors are trying to get published. So this is from the International Journal of Composition Studies. The guy who wrote it, Vershawn Young, is a doctor of composition, doctor of English. So I just wanted to have that as our preface here, right? That this is an academic doing this. This isn't just like anyone putting this ideas out here. This is someone who studied this stuff a lot and has then kind of come to these opinions. So first thing that I asked you guys about was the writing style here. Like I said, some people will always find it. Some students will always tell me that they find it like annoying or confusing. But if nothing else, I think it's interesting and engaging, which to me is just something that's really, before we get into the argument here, that's just something that is really underrated about writing in general. Like when you had to do writing in the past for high school or for college, how much did it factor into things like whether the writing was interesting or engaging, or if it was going to like keep the audience's attention? This essay I think does that, whether you agree or disagree with the argument. So I think that kind of shows us something, that when we write in a style that is closer to how we talk or closer to like how our thoughts come to us, I think audiences can pick up on that and they can connect to that, whether or not they end up agreeing with it or if they think that the way it's written is annoying. If nothing else, like I said, it's interesting and holds our attention. So, yeah, I always have some people who like the writing style here, some people who find it annoying. I will say that, there's always some people who say that it's like confusing or they don't understand it. And I always wonder how much of that is just that we're not expecting it, even though I didn't necessarily tell you it was, written by a doctor, published in a journal before you read it. You still know it's a, college class getting started, and the whole thing. So when we see it, I think we're definitely taken back, we're surprised. We probably never read an essay that was written like this, but I think honestly a lot of the stuff that we read is in dialect because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think for you guys nowadays, and maybe for me too, most of the reading that we do is on the internet and specifically on social media. And it's like, how many of the social media posts that you read in a day, how many of them are in standard English and how many of them are in dialect? And like, do you have a hard time reading the ones that are in dialect, or do you have a hard time understanding them? I don't know. I also think about this in relation to like music. Like, what's the most popular kind of music right now? I mean, they just had the Super Bowl with 50 Cent and Eminem and Dr. Dre and stuff. For the past 20 years, the most popular kind of music has been like some sort of rap or hip hop, something related to that. And none of that stuff was in standard English. But people still liked it. And I don't think people are totally confused by it. I think that there's maybe slang that you don't know when you first hear it. Like, I remember listening to those 50 Cent songs when I was a kid growing up in the suburbs. And at first you didn't know what the words meant, but you just kind of learned it and sort of roll with it and figure it out. And I think that's kind of the approach that Vershawn Young is asking for us to have here, being open to different dialects, being open to learning new slang terms or different dialect ways of speaking, and kind of incorporating that in the ways that we already talk, and yeah, meshing everything together, right? Code meshing is what he ends up calling it. But yeah, so I wonder how much of the writing style is just that we're not expecting it. And I wonder if like, if every essay we had read throughout school had been written like this, would it seem weird? I don't know. So I personally don't think that it's that hard to understand what he's saying here once we kind of get used to it. And I think the kind of dialect he's using is something that we've all like been exposed to, like living in America. It's stuff that you hear, like using like mo, like mo for more, right? And that kind of stuff. So I wanted to look at what I take to be his thesis here. Um, I'm looking on the second page, on page 111, at the bottom of the paragraph, kind of under the block quote in the middle of the page. He says, and that's my exact argument, that we all should know everybody's dialect, at least as many as we can, and be open to the mix of them in oral and written communication. So I think it's important to be clear about like what he's arguing here and what he's not arguing. He's not saying that everyone should use the dialect he's using. You know, he's not saying that like this like standard English that's bad, but like oh this is how everyone should be talking. He's saying that there shouldn't be one dialect that like rules all others. I think one thing he's asking us to do is to look at standard English as itself a dialect, you know, and to make us ask the question of like, well, why is this one dialect inherently better than any other dialect, you know? And when we say dialect, that's like a very specific word. It doesn't mean just anything that we make up, you know? It's not like if you ever made up a secret language when you were a kid where you know you like switch the syllables of something with your friends so like you know your mom doesn't know that you're talking about her or something like that. That's not a dialect, you know. That's just like something that two people are making up. Or like I personally can't just make up a new word and now that's part of the dialect. Dialect, it's a much more like organic, sort of ground up kind of thing. It, a dialect is something that has to actually be spoken and understood by a group of people. And you can ask questions about, like, okay, well, when does it become used by enough people that it reaches the level of dialect? Those are complicated questions. Those are, you know, kind of historical, sociological, linguistic questions that you could get into. But a dialect is not just something that anyone can make up. So, like, even the dialect that he's using here, it's not that there's no rules to it or that there's no anarchy to it. Like, he's still using capital letters. He's still ending the sentence with a period. He's still, like, using commas and stuff like that. It's just speaking in a different dialect. So what he's asking us to do is be open to the mixture of dialects in oral and written communication. So I think people tend to agree with him this far pretty easily that like, okay, yeah, we should be open to it. We shouldn't like, I guess, judge people by the way that they speak or something. The place where I'll get a little more pushback from students is when we talk about writing, say, academic essays, right? Because obviously Vershawn Young wants to go all the way with this. He believes that dialect should be seen as acceptable really in any form of writing, including an academic essay, which is what he's doing here. He just did it, right? He just wrote an essay, an academic essay in dialect. He's done it now. It's here in front of you. So I wonder if you guys would go that far with it. Should this be acceptable for that sort of thing? I've heard some students say no, that where like they'll agree that everyone should have their language, but not that it should be used in something like an academic essay. And I think we need to dig a little bit deeper to see like what Vershawn Young's response would be to that. So I want to read another quote. This is also on page 111. This is above like that black quote in the middle of the page. He says here, standard language ideology is the belief that there is one set of dominant language rules that stem from a single dominant discourse like standard English that all writers and speakers of English must conform to in order to communicate effectively. So he's a standard language ideology is what he calls this. And the word ideology is confusing. It basically means like a belief or like a belief system. So what he's drawing our attention to here is the belief that there is such a thing as a standard language. Because you know, we just take it for granted when we're in elementary school. It's like, oh, this is the way you do it. This is how you spell stuff. This is where the comma goes. And we're like, okay, those are the rules. But when you start asking questions about this, like, well, okay, well, why are those the rules? Or like, where did these rules come from? How did we end up with these systems? Things get a little more complicated because I feel like the way that it's taught to us, it seems like these grammar rules were just like handed down from God or you know from somewhere up high. Like you know what is it? They went up the mountain with and they came down with the tablets with the commandments and it said like. You must use a comma when there's a conjunctive clause, or like you can use this is the semicolon is only used with two independent clauses. Like, no, that's not how this happened, right? This is not these aren't eternal divine rules that were given to us, these grammar rules. So where did they come from? I think the answer is humans created them, right? So just like any system created by humans, I think we can you know critique it or look at it and say, well, you know, why do I have to submit to this? Like these were humans just like me who invented this stuff, who said this is the right way to do it, this is the wrong way to do it. Another thing, if you actually look at this historically, the idea of like a dictionary, because that's another thing people will say, oh, well, spelling, how do we know how to spell stuff? It's in the dictionary. The first dictionary was produced, I think, in like the 1700s or so. It's not something that was always around. Like humans using language and even written language has been around for thousands of years, in various forms in various places. And the idea of having like a dictionary, like a systematic thing that's like this is the right way and this is the wrong way, that idea is really only a few hundred years old. So it's very new, I would say, in the historic scope of things. It's like I remember I had a class where I had to read like the diary of John Smith, who was one of the like early English colonists coming to America. And there's all kinds of random wacky spellings. They spell like Swift with like an E on the end, or like the thing of like shop where it's like two P's and an E, or like he'll do it differently in on a different page of his own diary that this guy was writing, right? So it just shows how the idea of like a standard English is a very new idea, but that's not how it's presented to us. From the time we first come into school, it's presented as, well, this is how it's always been. This is how everyone does it. This is how we need to do it. So when we start looking at it this way, we can also ask questions of like, okay, well, who were the people who made these decisions? And since we're talking about the English language, I think we can say a couple of things about that. I think we can say that the people who made these decisions about grammar and stuff, that they were probably academics. They were probably so. And then if we look at, well, who were academics in like the 16 and 1700s? The elite, the 1%, the very richest people. It wasn't like today where a lot of people go to college. Almost no one went to college at those times. So someone who was like a doctor who's going to write a dictionary or whatever, they must have been from a very narrow sector of society. They must have been, rich coming up. Since we're talking about English, we're talking about people in England, so they're probably also white. Obviously, given again the time period, they're probably also men. So I think there's a way too that what gets to be determined the standard is just kind of like what the people in power did, and then it's like, well, everyone else needs to do what we do. You know. So I think there's an element of that here as well. But again, so that's his idea of standard language ideology. So I think once we start looking at it this way, again, we can start to see standard English as not like the sun that everything else revolves around. That like maybe the way we write on the way we talk on the internet is like a dialect that revolves around the standard. Or Vershawn Young, he refers to the way he writes in the essay as Black English, and then that's like another dialect like revolving around standard English. What he's asking us to do again is just see standard English as not the sun at the center, but just another planet, right? Where there's just different dialects, and none of them is really inherently better than any other, because why would they be? And you can kind of do this with any sort of standard, look at it this way, like standards around morality, or standards around like beauty. I know this is a thing, like if you look back in history at different time periods, different like whatever figures, or different types of people were considered beautiful, like that in like the 1600s or whatever, they would put like white powder on their faces, and women would wear those big dresses and everything, and that was considered attractive at the time. And now it's the opposite, that people go tanning, they wear less clothes, and that's attractive. So these things change over time. I think is a big insight that we need to kind of understand what's happening here. Because there's a way where we're like, oh, well, standard English, like that's just natural. That's how it's always been. That's how it has to be. And if you look at the history of this stuff, it's just not the case. It hasn't been that way for that long. So here's something else that I would pose to the people, and I saw some people saying this in our discussion boards. The idea that standard English is like easier to understand, or if we're too accepting of dialects, people will not be able to communicate, or there'll be misunderstandings. So I would ask you, what's easier to understand? The way that Vershawn Young writes in the essay, or this quote, which is from Fish, right? So this is supposed to be in standard English. This is again on page 111. This is the block quote in the middle of the page. And I just want to read the beginning of it, and tell me what's easier to understand, the way Vershawn Young writes in the essay, or this part. When Fish says, if students infected with the facile egalitarianism of soft multiculturalism declare, and he goes on. I don't think that's very easy to understand, right? And if you've ever tried to read journal articles, or like when you do this like academic research, the stuff that you read in there, is it super easy to understand? It's just not, It's very jargon based. It's very hyper specific to the discipline or the field that it's published in. Like when I had to read articles about novels and stuff, as an English major, um, it was like some of the words that they were using would be, yeah, things you've never heard of. They're talking about, the ontotheological dimensions of the text, and you're like, I don't even know what you're saying. So I really do kind of question this idea that standard English has to be used because it's the easiest for everyone to understand. Um, so yeah, and kind of similarly, Vershawn Young says here on 111, he says, "Don't nobody all the time, nor do they in the same way subscribe to or stand or follow standard modes of expression." That's another thing. There's so many rules to this stuff. Nobody knows them all. I don't know them all. I used to teach. I hated doing this. I had to do it, but I used to teach like SAT prep stuff where like you'd have to teach grammar rules or whatever, and like I went through an English master's program. I wrote a very long thesis for to get the degree, and I didn't know all these rules. When I was teaching this stuff at the SAT place, I had to like look at the book and like read to the students, but okay, semicolon, here's how you do it. And we'll talk about grammar at some point in the class because I know you guys might be worried about it. I know you'll have professors who are worried about it. But I think it's just important that we kind of reframe what we think of as good writing or try to get our priorities straight and what makes a piece of writing good. For me, I would say that if we're making a list of what are the most important factors to an essay being good, the grammar and the that stuff is very low on that list for me. Stuff like the argument, the quotes that you're using, the organization of the paragraphs, intro, conclusion, all of those things to me are a lot more important than the grammar. I'd rather read a paper that's interesting and convincing and has good examples but bad grammar than one that has perfect grammar but doesn't have those other things. So I don't know. I wonder if you guys agree with me about that. Just to give us some other quotes here, on page 112, he writes, "What we need to do is enlarge our perspective about what good writing is and how good writing can look at work, at home, and at school." Um, he also uses a term in this paragraph of 112. He uses this term linguistic self-hate. And I think that's a great way of describing like, the experience of going through English classes in school. Where basically what you're told is just that like the way that you think the words that come to your mind are wrong. They're not the correct ones. You have to say it this way, or else it's like not valuable. It's not worth saying. And I think something that is a real problem for a lot of my students is that they'll tell me like I know what I want to say in my head, but then when I try to write it, it doesn't come out the right way. And I think part of the reason for that is because we're trying to take our language, the way that we think, the way that we talk, and we're trying to basically translate it into this like academic, fancy standard English. And in trying to do that, we lose the meaning. So what we end up with is just basically a bunch of bullshit. We end up with just a bunch of words where like we either don't fully know what they mean or like we're just trying to make the essay longer and not worrying if we're communicating our message as clearly as we can. But I think it's bad. I think it instills bad habits in us when it comes to writing, and I think it is something like linguistic self hate, like Vershawn Young says here. Um, okay, so another point that I want to get to. Oh, he gives us a few words here. So still on 112, he says instead of prescribing how folks should write or speak, I say we teach language descriptively. So I think this divide here between looking at language prescriptively, like a prescription, or descriptively is a big one. So to teach it prescriptively would be to teach it kind of top down, right? Here are the rules, and we'll teach them to everyone, and we'll enforce it on people. Whereas descriptively would be to see, okay, well, how do people actually talk? How do people actually communicate with each other? And we'll just kind of try to document that and be like, hey, this is how people talk. This is what they say. These are the words that are used. And just again to the idea of language like changing all the time and what's considered standard changing all the time. You always hear that there's like new words added to the dictionary. Like, it was only a couple of years ago they added like Google as a verb, like to Google something to the dictionary. And they're always super late on that stuff, right? Like it always takes them like 8 years of people using the term before they're like, okay, fine, we'll put it in the dictionary. And it's like, did it become a thing because they put it in the dictionary? No, it became a thing when everyone knew what it meant, when people knew what it meant. And at first, someone might not have known. What can you remember the first time you heard someone tell you like, oh, can you just Google that for me? Like, did you know what they meant? Did you not? If you didn't, would you learn what they meant? Kind of similarly, I remember learning new words for my students a lot. I remember like a couple of semesters ago, a student kind of taught me the word bet like as an affirmation. Like I think I was teaching class and I was like, okay guys, here's your homework. Read this, do this. And one of the students goes like, all right, bet. I was like, "What? You're talking about like gambling? Like, what do you mean bet? You want to bet me about whether or not you're going to do the homework?" And he was like, "No, no, it's like bet. It's like okay, good, like got it." And I was like, "Oh, all right, there you go." And that's how you learn the stuff, right? So I think again, that's all they're asking for is just this idea of like being open and like learning new things. Because basically, like you're gonna have to pretty much learn a new dialect in your major. Like I was talking about the major of like or the dialect of like English majors and English essays and stuff. I'm sure there's one for biology and accounting and criminal justice and whatever else you might be doing. So that's kind of part of it here. Okay, a couple more things with this, and I'll try to wrap up soon. Another issue here, I think, is professionalism. Like that's something students will say. Like you have to use standard English because like it's more professional. If you talk the way Vershawn Young writes in this essay, like that's unprofessional. And I think we can ask the same kind of questions about what counts as professional, as we did about like what counts as the standard language. Well, who decided that's professional? Like who decided that a shirt with buttons like this and a collar like this, that like that's what's professional? Where did that come from? And again, if we look back in history, that these are things that are made up by humans, not really even that long ago. If you go back to the 1800s, even what was considered professional wear, it might have been some kind of suit, but they wore like their socks really high and they had like breeches instead of pants. Like if you go back even a couple hundred years, all of this stuff is different. So that, to me, has to mean that it's possible that it could be different in the future, right? So if I was gonna, there's kind of two separate things here. There's a practical point of like if you're going to a job interview tomorrow, like would you try to use standard English or would you use a dialect? Obviously, you're gonna try to use standard English because there's just the impression that that's like what's expected or that's what's wanted. But I think it's a different question to ask, like, well, is that how it should be, or is it right that that's the way it is? There's like the way things are, and then there's the way things should be. And I don't think just because things are a certain way means that we shouldn't consider how they should be because things change all the time. So with this idea of professionalism, again, once we realize that it's something that changes, that it's something that has a history to it, we can start like there's a few examples of this. Like tattoos is a big one to me. Like people back in the 80s or whatever, not that I was around to know, but my understanding is that tattoos were considered, hugely taboo and unprofessional. Like if you had a tattoo, it was like, oh, like you're a hippie or something, or like you're there's no way you're getting a job. But I just don't think that's how it is anymore. Like maybe I think face tattoos are still in this realm of unprofessional. But having a tattoo, even on your arm or your neck or something, like I don't think that's like a crazy thing anymore. That means you can't be hired. My sister has a tattoo that's like visible depending on what she's wearing, and she's like a salesperson. She used to have a job in Manhattan before she moved. So I think that's we've seen that change kind of in real time. Another example that Vershawn Young gives in the essay is like hairstyles, like specifically black people wearing like natural hair or like braids. How that used to really be considered unprofessional, how people wouldn't even get hired at all. And maybe that still sticks around a little bit, like whatever. I'm sure there's some old people around who still think that way, but I think they're very much in the minority now. Like I think people have become much more accepting of that sort of thing. And there's even been laws passed in some states. I don't know. I think it was New York maybe a couple years ago passed a law that you can't like discriminate against someone at work like based on their hairstyle. So we've seen what counts as professional change before. So could that happen with dialect or with language? I don't know. Maybe it could. If it was going to, I think it would take like the young people now when they're eventually older, kind of having a different perspective on all this stuff, which I think is honestly very possible. Because I feel like there's no one growing up, right? Like there's no one who's like 20 or 25 right now who's like, no, grammar is super important to me. I think the day of the grammar Nazi has come and gone. You still see this on the internet sometimes where people like will try to correct someone on like the kind of your they're using. And to me, even as an English teacher, it's always like cringy to me when someone's correcting that because just who cares? Like, what are we doing? I think there's also like I don't know, some kind of like vindictiveness or like some kind of like moral superiority thing where people want to like, chop someone down for not having the correct grammar or whatever. And that's just strange to me. I see this with like a lot of English teachers when you watch them, marking up in red pen these papers. Well, that's not where the comma goes. That's not a complete sentence. This is a run-on sentence. And it's like, what are you getting out of this? Because I don't think you're really helping the students learn anything. I think it's, I don't know. It's like a kind of like bloodlust or something. I don't know. Sort of like revenge that they're trying to get. Very strange to me. Um, so right. So he uses this term code meshing. He says code meshing is what we do whenever we communicate, writing, speaking, whatever. Code meshing blends dialects, international languages, local idioms, chat room lingo, and the rhetorical styles of various ethnic and cultural groups in both formal and informal speech acts. So when he's talking code meshing, it's again, it's not just using the dialect he's speaking in, or even just one dialect. Like if you notice, there are certain sentences in this essay that are in standard English. Like I think the quote that I read about standard language ideology, that whole sentence is standard English. So it's meshing, it's mixing standard English with the way we talk in text messages, with the way your grandpa talks, with whatever else, right? With like pop culture references or something like that, and making it all into one thing. And that's what he means by code mention. So yeah, I like to do this at the beginning of the semester. Oh, last thing with professionalism, I kind of got to this, but he makes a point about race as well. And I asked you guys that question about like the status quo and that whole thing. And some people had this in their responses, and then your responses were really good. Great job with the discussion board, by the way. But some people were saying this, that like one way that this can work, because I was saying basically, and I think it's Vershawn Young's position, that the idea of standard English, standard language ideology, that whole thing, that it works to keep the status quo in place, to keep the people in power, and to keep the people on the bottom in the bottom. And some of you mentioned this, that if you grow up with the people around you speaking standard English, if your parents talk like that, if the people that are in your house when you're a baby, when they talk like that, and you grow up more or less speaking standard English, then when you go to school, they're like, okay, here's your worksheet. You have to do standard English. And you're like, oh, okay, here, no problem. I've been doing that my whole life. It's easy. And you get a good grade, and the teachers are like, wow, you're so smart. On the flip side, if you grew up when people were speaking a different dialect, if you grew up, speaking Spanish or whatever, like the kind of way that Vershawn Young writes in the essay or anything like that, if you grew up with anything that's not standard English, then when you go to school, they're like, okay, now you have to write standard English. And you're like, what? You have to learn a whole new thing to even get to the same baseline. So I think you could see how this like perpetuates over generations, where the people who their family went to college the previous generation, now they already have a leg up, that kind of a thing. And it's not to say that no one can overcome that. Of course, many people do. But it's just that it just like has a hand in kind of keeping the cycle of inequality going in that sort of way. Vershawn Young also makes the point that like some people are allowed to not speak standard English and some aren't. I think he mentions like George Bush is having like a hard time with standard English. And obviously the same thing could be said of like Trump or something that they didn't speak standard English, and in fact people like that. They're like, oh, that's good. They don't speak standard English. But then you think of, I don't know, somebody like Obama, who was like the most standard English, who in his speeches you can like see where the commas are when he talks. It's like, well, if Obama spoke in dialect the way that some other white politicians have, how would it have been viewed? Like would people have voted for him the same way? Would he be president? Like, it's kind of like I guess like a twice as good kind of thing, where like Obama had to be even more standard than anyone else. So that's another way that I think Vershawn Young sees like race playing into this. One last thing on that is like if you start to consider which dialects are considered professional or unprofessional, I think this gets revealing. For instance, if someone's trying to get an office job or whatever, right? And say they had a British accent, like a London type accent, is that going to be like viewed as unprofessional? I would say no, I don't think so. What about like a Southern accent, like a Charlestown, like Southern aristocrat type accent? I think that's also viewed as fine. It's maybe viewed as a little strange or not totally normal or something if you're in New York, but I don't think it's viewed as unprofessional. I don't think it's like, oh, we can't hire this person or we can't have that. But if you now consider the dialect that Vershawn Young writes the essay in, would that get viewed as unprofessional? If you consider someone who has like a Spanish accent, does that get viewed as unprofessional? I think they generally kind of do. So I think there's something to that. It's not only race either. I think there's also a class dimension to this. Like I said, a general Southern accent I think is fine, but if you had more of like a I don't know like a hillbilly type Southern accent or something like that, or I think Vershawn mentions like people with an Appalachian accent. I think that's kind of what he's getting at, and that I think is also considered unprofessional. And I think there like that's a dialect that's still largely spoken by white people, but poor white people. Similarly with I gave the example of England, like a London accent. There's also other dialects like a Cockney accent, is known to be like a lower class British accent versus like the London kind of posh accent. Even though like the London accent has different words, they say like loo for bathroom or lorry for truck or whatever. So it's not like it's easier to understand. Like there's still different terms, different vocabulary words, different spellings. They put a U in the word color and stuff like that. But that doesn't get viewed as unprofessional. So it kind of seems I don't know. You guys could disagree. Tell me if I'm going too far. Seems to me that the dialects that are spoken by upper class white people are generally considered fine and still professional, and the ones spoken by anyone who's a person of color or anyone who's lower class or poor are viewed as unacceptable and unprofessional. You know. So again, I tend to agree with this essay. You guys are free to disagree, and many people did in the discussions, and that's fine. But what I would say for everybody, and for this class and for all the writing you do in college, grammar is just not the most important thing. It just isn't. This isn't going to be a grammar class. I'm not going to bombard you guys with worksheets about subject, predicate, verb, object. I don't know. Maybe that's what you guys want. I don't know. We'll talk about it, like I said, since this is like the English basic skills. We'll cover it. I'll try to answer your questions. I'll give you my best advice. I'll make comments on your essays about grammar and stuff. I'll try to help you guys. But I just think that we've got to focus on our argument, how we're going to convince the reader, organizing our essays. And I think all of that will help us get to a better piece of writing quicker. All right, this video was too long. I'll try to make the next one shorter, and I'll talk to you guys soon.